Welcome back to the third series of the IDC Dialogue series, and we are focusing on the strategies needed to promote South-South cooperation among development finance institutions in Africa, the Asia-Pacific region, as well as the Caribbean. In the first part of the discussion, we focused on enhancing that cooperation in the South-South division of the DFIs, and then we also talked about value chain financing. In this part, we would like to focus on how governments can help create the environment that's needed for DFIs to work optimally, and what the DFIs themselves need to be telling governments to put in place so they're able to do their job to the best of our ability. Let me introduce my panel. These are all new guests, and I have, if I can begin from my immediate left, we've got Octavio Peralta. He asked me to call him Bobby. Bobby, thank you for coming. He is the Secretary General of the Association of Development Finance Institutions in Asia and Pacific. Next to him is Patrick Dlamini. He is the CEO of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. And the last but not least, we've got James Karanga. He's the board member of the Association of African Development Finance Institutions. Gentlemen, welcome. Let me begin with our distinguished visitor. Governments, of course, are a big player in terms of creating the environment in which we all operate. But we do know that SMEs in particular, the sector that we're targeting, do need an enabling environment created by governments. What do we want these governments to put in place to make sure that Patrick and other banks that are operating in this sector do their job to the best of their ability, from where you stand, from the experience of Asia?
Thank you, Godfrey. From the perspective of the Asia-Pacific region, I think there's now more a realization that DFIs are important player in the financial system. There was a time when DFIs have been criticized for not doing its job well. And so what I'm trying to say is that government support is critical for DFIs to do their job well. Of course, that comes in the form of, in terms of providing support, perhaps
right.
in funding, policy support, also lending them with perhaps advice and linkages with other financial institutions.
Yeah. James, could I come to you perhaps and talk about the absolute minimums that we need from a regulatory perspective for DFIs to work properly?
Thank you. I would like to say that the governments basically are the owners of these DFIs.
Right. They are the shareholders.
They are the shareholders, yes, and they have invested money in those institutions. And it is their responsibility to ensure that these DFIs are challenged to perform, to ensure that a reasonable return, not maximum return, but a reasonable return is actually coming back to the shareholder. Yeah. Because the governments are actually investing public funds. And the public is actually expecting that their money is not going to be put to waste. Hence, there is need of ensuring that there is infrastructure in place in terms of good governance and also in terms of the regulatory framework, so that those financial institutions are going to give a return on whatever actually has been put in them that is back to the shareholders.
Let me come to you, Patrick. And I'm putting you in a slightly difficult position because, as we're saying, you were talking to your shareholder.
Yes.
Minimum, what do you need? And what do we need to take out? If perhaps we can use the example of South Africa.
I think from my perspective, it's important that governments create the conducive environment for DFIs to operate and to operate effectively so that we can be able actually to ensure that there is maximum developmental impact. And it is also quite important for governments to ensure that the mandates that they give to DFIs as shareholders also points into the direction of maximum impact in the economy.
Do they need to deliberately favor DFIs?
DFIs create a catalytic environment for job creation and economic prosperity. Therefore, it's important for government to ensure that there's maximum and optimal support given to DFIs.
Right. Let's move the conversation to financial inclusion, because it's a big part of what we're talking about here. Because the people that we're trying to reach through DFIs are people normally out of our formal economies, from Asia. How do we ensure financial inclusion? How do we build the structures that enable us to reach the farmer who's down in Mpumalanga, versus, of course, the guys who are sitting in Soweto and are closer to technology and all these other advantages that we have in modern-day society?
Well, financial inclusion in our part of the world, especially through the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, is a big initiative in Asia. Because they realize that at least maybe more than 60% of the citizens there are not provided enough financial services, especially, as you mentioned, rural areas, people, artisans, and small businesses. So there has been an effort in terms of regulatory environment of providing assistance, whether through the development banks, the central banks, commercial banks,
right,
to be able to really go down to those who are excluded in accessing financial services.
Yeah. Patrick, how do we make sure that the guy in Limpopo actually knows that there's a DBSA and that actually it's there for him and he could make use of it?
That's a very interesting question, because the aspirant guy in Limpopo or Mpumalanga wants to succeed, and that guy wants the requisite support in terms of DFIs, making sure that he's able actually to put his ambition into reality. And therefore, we need to make sure that these guys are able actually to access DFIs and are able actually to understand the requirements that they have to meet,
right,
for us to be able actually to successfully support them and to ensure that there is also technical support that is extended to these budding entrepreneurs. We have seen the world over how much of a role that guys from rural towns or SMEs have played in ensuring that there is job creation for a much more broader, in a much more inclusive way. So those ordinary guys with their ambition need guidance, and we need to make sure that as DFIs we create platforms and facilities in such a way that actually are able actually to provide mentorship and to provide guidance and to advise them as to how they can be able actually to grow and become much more better and be able actually to operate at a much more sophisticated level.
The other point you make, of course, is that SMEs actually should be an engine for job creation, and yet we are not fully maximizing them. What is the problem there?
On the continent, I think that is one area where we've really come quite short, and I believe that we have a long way to go. Because on the continent of Africa, we have challenges of poverty. We have challenges of financial inclusiveness that we fail to achieve there. We have challenges of higher unemployment. And it has been proven the world over that SMEs play such a critical role in creating economic opportunities for the unemployed, in eradicating poverty. I think if we were to look at the case of Brazil, we look at the case of India, it's been a classical case, and I think on the continent we really need to play much more greater emphasis in creating sustainable and thriving SMEs. And as DFIs, we have a very critical role to play in that sphere.
James, what are your frustrations when you deal with governments in trying to make them understand the work that your organization does, the work that members of your organization, such as the DBSA, are doing to try to make sure that they are making a difference?
One of the problems that you find DFI facing, and especially in my own country, is that they're most like being left on their own as far as the handling of the lending is concerned. That support that we would be expecting from the major shareholder, who is actually the government, has not been forthcoming at a speed that you would expect. You'll find that role of job creation, that role of poverty alleviation is being left basically to the mainstream banking sector. And maybe microfinancial institutions.
But that's ironic, isn't it? Because it is in the interest of the governments themselves to actually create jobs. Because by creating jobs, they can go to the electorate and say, tell you what, we are the guys with the answers to your job creation. And therefore, please put us back in office because we have created jobs. So why are they not working harder to reach the vast majority of the people who we know are outside of mainstream economies?
Well, I'm glad to say that that has been a main problem in the past. But as of now, infrastructure is actually being put in place to ensure that the DFIs in Kenya, for example, the five DFIs in Kenya are actually major participants as far as this role is concerned.
Has there been a change? Are we beginning to see any kind of recognition improvement?
Yes, there is actually a change.
Would you agree, Patrick?
We've seen actually a huge change on the continent in terms of economic growth. If we're to look at 1994, the continent combined GDP in dollar terms was about 500 billion. And 2011, we're sitting at about 1.8 trillion US dollars in terms of GDP. And a lot of our countries actually have come out of a basket case, or so-called basket case, where we used to be so reliant on donors from the developed nations. And thanks to political guidance and political vision actually that we've seen, and now we need to say, then how then do we plug up the gaps, and the gaps around structural issues. The issue of infrastructure on the continent and the intertrade within the continent is a huge challenge. And now we need to start paying much more big attention on aggressively developing infrastructure and infrastructure networks so that we can be able actually to enable trade within the continent. So that again, then our guys can then be able to begin to then graduate to a bigger level in terms of international exposure.
My last question before we go to the floor to open up for questions is to you, Bobby. Of course, part of the reason why you're here is that we want to learn from you. Of course, we want you to go and see the big five, but we want to learn from you first about how to enhance DFIs cooperation. From an Asian perspective, are you seeing that recognition within governments, and how did you make them understand that they need to do more and create the environment for DFIs to work better?
Well, first of all, I just want to add on the issue of government, because government, they have their hands full in so many things. In our part of the world, what's happening is it's the DFIs that's actually being proactive, providing them advice on how to go. So it's not always that the government should be able to support the DFI, but it's also the DFI that we try to also provide advice. So it's a close relationship between the owner and the DFI.
True.
So that's happening in our part of the world, and to increase this cooperation, I think it's a valid point and very important that the Africans and the Asians in this context through the DFIs are helping together.
Absolutely. You need to help them.
Both ways, actually.
Let's see if we can share some common experiences in trying to develop DFIs around the African continent, learning from the lessons that we have from Asia. As I said before, the session is now open for questions or contributions from the floor. If you can keep them short and sharp, we would like to take your questions. We've got a hand here right at the front. Thank you, sir.
I would like to suggest that can't we take this cooperation further? Rather than be just study tours, say, by African delegates to Asia and the Pacific, we have exchange programs where we can, for example, position our staff to learn specific sectors, how you handle specific issues and sectors. And the same thing with the guarantee schemes, that perhaps in Africa where they are not even provided for, maybe the Asia Pacific consider assisting us, setting up those guarantee schemes in such areas so that we can learn. And clearly they have had a greatest impact in terms of job creation. So can't we take this to a higher level, higher gear? I think that's my comment.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. I think it's a valuable contribution, exchange programs, and assistance setting up those credit guarantee schemes. So can I begin with you?
Yeah, actually, in ADFIAP, we've been doing the immersion programs. As you said, these officers of one institution is learning from one institution. We call it DFI to DFI exchange. So they're not only learning through training, but also observation, immersion, and observation in a particular DFI. So that's being done, and you're right, perhaps there's scope for African DFIs to also do the same thing in Asia and also vice versa.
Absolutely. I think it's a question also for the African Association.
Yes, actually what has happened so far is that we have had the African CEOs visiting Korea and also India. And I would say that this is just the beginning. I can see this being extended further to ensure that we have got the exchange programs covering or going down to the staff members, that is, of the various institutions, so that they can be able to learn exactly what the Asians are doing that we are not doing, that we can be able to develop our DFIs. And also, as far as the implementation of these exchange programs, I'm looking forward to a time when various countries, various governments are going to liaise with the from Kenya are going to liaise with other various governments, that is in Asia, who have actually been able to perfect the art, so that they can be able to learn on how to ensure that the same guarantees are applicable here, so that we can actually be able to put together and ensure that poverty alleviation, job creation, and also economic development actually is achieved in the countries in Africa.
We can take more questions. There's a hand right there.
Mr. Facilitator, when you start your questions, you raised a quite interesting point. What is the bottom line for the DFIs? And I got the impression that we received two different answers, which is good. But one puts emphasis on the ownership, state ownership. The other answer put emphasis on the conducive environment. I think this is important to debate these differences, because the idea that DFIs must be absolutely state-owned, it's not part of my experience. And I do not see it as a basic condition. I am myself, I am the CEO of a DFI that exists for 22 years, and from the very first day, it was a public-private partnership, and is still surviving, is growing. All others, absolutely parastatal, they have died, they have bankrupted. It's important because in some countries, and we have to recognize this quite honestly, in some countries where our states are still fragile, governance is not yet very strong, the principle of public-private partnership works very well. So what I do believe is some of our governments are not yet well prepared, and this is very important, to interact with them, to create a conducive environment to promote finance for development. This is my comment. The second point, it's also the concept that DFIs are something one size fits all. I have some doubt on this. DFIs for big infrastructure projects do not have conditions to play a role on rural SMEs projects. So I think also in DFIs, as well in many other things, one size doesn't fit all. But unfortunately, some of our governments, our governments with a new resource, they tend again to create new big elephants. One size fits all. There's a risk, and I'd like to receive your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your contribution. I think it's an important point. Should DFIs be solely state-owned? Do we need private money in DFIs, or are governments the sole provider for long-term finance? Patrick, you want to come in? I want to open it as well to our previous panelists to answer this question, should they feel they want to contribute.
I do agree. I don't think you'll ever have a situation where one size fits all. But at the same time, PPPs require a radical change in regulatory environment to enable the creation of PPPs actually to happen. In developing countries, you find that that's where you tend to have a much more bigger challenge. But for DFIs to be successful, it is extremely vital that they have a very, very maximum support from the state, because DFIs aren't supposed to be primarily driven by profits.
Sure.
So I agree, it can never be a one-size-fits-all, but for PPPs to thrive and to be successful, you need a creation of an environment that's going to be conducive for that, and that will give certainty to the private sector to come in and play their role.
Yeah. Private money, can you make a difference?
Let me just first go to the models, because we talk about the PPP model. In Asia, there are 3 models actually that is emerging. First is the traditional policy-based institutions, DFIs, that are directly mandated by government to do development work.
Right.
And then there's getting to be bigger chunk will be the universal banks, doing both development and commercial because of the ownership issue. And then third are very specific DFIs like SME banks, housing banks, infrastructure, agricultural bank. So what I'm saying is, if you talk about the ownership of government, of course there are issues, but in the end, what the recent global crisis told us is that there's a role for government to intervene. And I think in market failures, in times when there's difficulty for other financial institutions to come in, the DFI should be there.
Let's go for closing comments from our panelists. If I can begin from my extreme left, your final comments, please, in terms of the contributions that we've had from the floor around issues of ownership, around issues of pricing, around issues of perhaps technical support from institutions like the African Development Bank.
Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator. Maybe just to start with the last one. We are aware, that is from the ADFI Executive Committee, that there is a change in approach as far as ADB is concerned with regard to involvement of the DFIs in Africa to ensure that the DFIs are able to perform their expected roles, and that is to be full participants as far as the economic development is concerned, and also on job creation and poverty alleviation. That one at least is on record. With regard to the government's support on the DFIs, maybe I'd like to remove this notion. What the DFIs are looking for is not the funding from the exchequer, because as someone has said before, we are aware that the African governments are actually quite strained as far as resources are concerned. But we are looking for facilitation for these institutions to go outside there as institutions which are backed by their own governments, mobilize funds which are going to be used for the development in these countries.
Right.
These are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Patrick?
Thank you, sir. I think as ADFI, we have a very long road ahead of us. And we have a road.
Do we have time, though?
We might have watches, but I don't think we have time. And to me, it's quite important that as ADFI, we need now actually to start year in, year out, when we meet to celebrate successes and milestones achieved. We also need to look at how we can then be able to leverage on international partnerships that some of our ADFI members might have. A case in point is DBSA as a reference bank for the BRICS. How can we make sure, without being presumptuous, that we're representing the interests of the continent? How can we make sure that we're able actually to work together with ADFI and be able actually to look at how can we promote the interest of the continent within these blocks of emerging nations? Because I think there's a huge room that we can play. We have a role to play, but we need to work very close with each other to promote the interests of the continent.
Absolutely. Let's learn from Asia.
Yeah. Many years ago, the death sentence has been given to DFIs. And the proof is that up till now, the DFIs are here to stay. And so for resilient, well-governed, and well-managed DFIs, it's a long way to go, because there will always be a gap to fill, there will always be a catalytic role to play, and that is the role for DFIs.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Bobby, from the Association of Asian and Pacific African Development Finance Institutions. Patrick, CEO DBSA from South Africa. James Karanga, board member of AADFI here in Africa. Thanks very much indeed. You've been watching the third series in the IDC Dialogues here on CNBC Africa, where we've been discussing the role of DFIs and perhaps the cooperation that we need to see between South-South nations in terms of developing and enhancing their agenda and development plans going forward. From me, Godfrey Mutizwa, goodbye.